welcome everybody. Thank you for being here today. I was telling the folks as we were coming in, it's such a privilege, honestly, to take time and to focus on something as important as this, and to have the experts with us who are going to be with us today, and these women who are part of 100 Strong, who are working so actively to make the world better, to engage and to, bring their full focus and energy to this. So I just want to say thank you. And we also have Idel Silan with us. She is the country office director of Ukraine. And I've gotten to know her through the Save the Children mentoring project that we're doing. And I think, Idel, do you want to put your camera on? And if you can hear me, say, there she is. And so she'll be able to answer some questions. She was evacuated, I guess, just last week and is back in Bangkok. So it'd be great to hear from you too today. So thank you for being here. But I want to introduce two new 100 Strong members who we're so happy to have with us today. One is Allison. I'm hope if I pronounce your name wrong, let me know. But Benj, is that it? She lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She's a partner at Pacifica Law Group, where she advises government entities on tax issues relating to public finance transactions. She's been a partner for more than 15 years to Save the Children, and is also part of our Sierra Leone project. So welcome, Allison. And I don't know if you want to say a few words to say hello.
Sure. I am so thrilled to be here. I feel really privileged to be part of this group. My thanks to Mary for getting me involved and kind of keeping this at the front of my mind. Honestly, it's just thrilling to be here. And if anybody has questions about municipal bonds, feel free to contact me.
Great. And we also have Anna Salisbury here with us today. So we're so thrilled to have her. She and her husband, Julian, began their relationship with SAVE over 10 years ago in London, and they've supported education programs all around the world and including here in the United States. So thank you for your support. And I don't know, would you like to say something, Anna?
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. It's very exciting, especially in the current climate, to be able to join such a strong group of women. Very excited.
Idel, do you want to say just a little bit also about, before we get into our discussion on global hunger, do you want to just say hello to folks?
So first I want to say thank you for inviting me to this call. It's my first time to face public after being evacuated. So it's nice to see Gabriela there and Yolanda, and of course to see Catherine. So that's one of the first things that came to my mind when I was wondering what I will say. I wanted to say thank you to 100 Women for sending Catherine over to me as a mentor, because she has been part of my journey in closing up my work in Iraq and starting in Ukraine. And she was with me through the journey of preparing my team for a possible war, a possible international war. And she was with me on the first day of the invasion and through the evacuation process. So I think her presence has helped me through this journey, and looking at myself as an individual, not just as a leader of my team in Ukraine. So I'll be happy to answer questions if something comes up around Ukraine, and share as much as I can. Just to note that I'm on leave at the moment, and there is an acting country director, Peter Walsh, and I've not been in touch with my team for 2 weeks now, so I'm not totally updated on what is going on. But Gabriela is here, and I'm sure Gabriela is quite informed on what's going on in our country program. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's like a privilege and an honor. She should be mentoring me, but to feel that kind of like full on active war trauma, is intense. It's just so intense. And it makes me even more grateful for all of you in this movement who do the work you do, because you really are like global angels, you know? So, again, in terms of speaking about like what the media talks about and doesn't talk about, and therefore what we in the United States who just sort of check our media feeds throughout the day, we don't hear a lot about global hunger at this point. And yet we know from Save the Children that, there's an increasing crisis, and it's what we call the 3 C's in our long range plan is, conflict, COVID, and climate change. And sometimes I sit around and I think, well, what are the specifics of that? Like, how do these things interrelate, and what is the state of global hunger? And so, we have these incredible humanitarian experts with us here today. And so I just want to introduce them briefly. We have Gabriella Wayman is Global Humanitarian Director. And we have Yolanda Wright is the Global Director for Poverty Reduction, Climate Resilience, and Urban. And they're going to share a little bit about themselves and talk about our global hunger crisis, which we're right in the middle of. And I really encourage you all to ask questions and dig in. And so we're going to hand it over to Gabriella to start us off. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So this is just briefly to introduce myself. And before I do so, just really wanted to indeed say welcome to Adele. It is lovely to see you under much better circumstances than the last time we spoke, which was, as you say, the full-on war and the sirens blaring. It was very, very dire situation that she was in. And I'm so glad that she's out and that she's safe. So my name is Gabriella Wayman. I am the Global Humanitarian Director for Save the Children. I've been in this role now for about 2.5 years, something to that effect, almost 3 years. And it's been quite the journey, hasn't it? Because I joined somewhere around September 2019. I was in the job for a few months, and then COVID started, and then Ethiopia came, and then Afghanistan came, and now Ukraine came. So we thought 2020 was tough. We thought 2021 was going to be, topping it. And here we are. It's been absolutely relentless. I've been saying that normally when the rest of the world shouts force majeure, that's when the humanitarian sector comes into action. But the humanitarian sector is screaming force majeure at the moment. It is too much. I've been in this sector for about 20 years, so I've seen a lot. It's probably one of the most rewarding jobs you can do. You do need sometimes to put your emotions away for the evening or for when you go to the sports hall. But despite sometimes the difficulties like that, it is by far the most rewarding job you can do. So thank you so much. And we'll talk a little bit more about hunger in a second. Over to you, Yolanda.
Thanks, Gabriella, and similarly, lovely to see you, Adele. I'm Yolanda Wright. I actually joined, I think, the same month as Gabriella. I left the UK government. Interestingly, on the day that Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, not completely coincidentally. But I used to I've worked in this sector for about 20 years. Majority was for the UK government as head of their humanitarian and conflict department, head of profession for livelihoods, worked on climate change. I've been posted overseas quite a number of years, 6 years in Bangladesh, really a country on the front line of the climate crisis, but also worked on Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Africa. I'm quite old. Worked in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was president on land reform and environmental issues. So quite a long and interesting career. I've loved my job in everywhere I've worked. And I've really enjoyed being part of Save the Children, a hugely, incredibly committed group of people to have joined 2.5 years ago. So it's a real privilege to work here. Thank you. So we were asked just to talk for a few minutes with a slide deck, but that most of this should be discussive. So I'll try not to waffle on too long with the slides. Thank you for sharing them. So the context of this is to try and give a big picture view of the global hunger crisis. And as Gabriella said, for those of us who've worked in this sector for a long time, this really is we keep having an unprecedented year after another unprecedented year. this quote is just to start with a quote from Elizabeth Watuthi, who actually spoke at a Save the Children event at COP26. And another speech when she was at COP26 in Glasgow about climate, she spoke about the very real impact of the climate crisis on children, and she spoke about the drought, ongoing drought in Kenya, which is very relevant to this topic today. You know, that basically children are right now being affected by, in this case, the climate crisis. But when we talk about the global hunger crisis, as Catherine said, we have to consider climate, conflict, and COVID, because all of those things exacerbate and feed off of each other. And the COVID crisis had a huge economic shock and an unprecedented reversal in a lot of the progress we'd seen globally. We've been seeing hunger going down, poverty going down. Yes, there were hotspots. Yes, there was pieces of the world that were left behind. There were issues, but overall the trend was positive. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is an unprecedented reversal of that progress. And instead of coming into 2022 and hoping to see economic recovery and hopefully a return to normal, instead we've now seen this horrific conflict breaking out in the Ukraine with massive knock-on effects as well. So that's the context of what I'm going to try and talk to you about. If we can see the next slide, please. So the next slide is from the IPC, which is an organization that tries to look globally at hunger and classify it on these different levels. One thing I'll say straight away is IPC data is not always available everywhere. So some countries like Syria and Lebanon, we just don't even have the data. So it's not that there aren't hungry populations in those countries, they're just not even on this map because we don't have such good data. And trickily, you'll see Ethiopia is not in this map at the moment, and there's a really difficult situation. You mentioned you've already been discussing Tigray previously, but we suspect that up to over 400,000 people are living in potentially famine-like conditions or on the very edge of famine-like conditions in Tigray, but the data is not officially, the way in which it's officially gathered for the IPC is not being allowed, it's not being validated by the government and therefore can't be shown. So this is a good map, there's some really good data, but there's also some missing data here that you might expect to be seeing. But what you can see from this map is a situation where across 80 countries, people are at risk of food insecurity right the way through to famine-like conditions. This is really a situation. IPC stands for integrated, it's really boring, integrated phase classification, sorry. It's a really boring technical thing, but they basically have 5 grades and the top grade, 5th, is basically famine. And it's the technical borders of those, for those different 5 groupings is around how many people, how many excess deaths there are. And so at the worst case, we're seeing really high rates of death. And as you probably all know, death from hunger is generally not pure starvation. It's health impacts of your body being very weak. And as we know from places like Somalia, previous famines, when you get famine-like conditions, about 50% of the people who die will be children, because it's particularly children under 5 that their bodies are not so capable of coping with lower food intake, then they get susceptible to diseases like pneumonia and sadly, a diet and unprecedented, at a higher rate than the average population. So this map of the world, it's a bit depressing. I can't really say anything other than it's a bit depressing. 10% of the world's population is undernourished, and this situation has been slowly creeping up. So since 2019 and the outbreak of COVID, the numbers of people in food insecurity have just gradually been increasing. And the really difficult thing is, it's almost like, where do you focus your attention? There is so much need in so many places. The one good thing I will say is Madagascar, the southern tip of Madagascar, did get a lot of attention towards the end of 2021, where it did reach famine conditions, and that situation has actually improved. But we're seeing a worsening situation in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and obviously the effect of the conflict in Ukraine is not only horrific for all of the people of Ukraine and people living in Ukraine who've been displaced, but it has a knock-on effect on global stability and food security, because both Ukraine and Russia are major wheat exporters, and world markets are predicting that wheat exports will be massively impacted by this conflict. Also, I'm sure you're all aware that fuel prices are really rising everywhere. And again, so obviously food to get around the world to countries that need to import it, like Yemen, it needs to be transported. So rising fuel costs, etc., are driving a worsening of this situation. So this map, unfortunately, we're predicting will be looking worse over time. Next slide, please. So just a couple of things on this slide, just to give you a context. OCHA, which is the UN coordinator of humanitarian affairs, so they have the sort of overview of all the different agencies, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, etc., said that hunger is rising and food insecurity is at unprecedented levels in the overview for 2022. And you can see just from some of these graphs what I'm trying to say here, that, look, over time from 2004, gradually chronically hungry people were getting fewer and fewer of them in the world. And then, as I was saying, from 2019, suddenly this spike, and sadly we just don't see that changing in 2022. We see it potentially getting worse. And as you'll see from the other graphs, the food price spikes, you can see the food price spike really heading up. And we know that, food price spikes have a disproportionate impact on low-income households, wherever they are. Low-income households in the US, low-income households in the UK, but also low-income households all over the world. And it's those families that are spending the biggest chunk of their disposable or of their income on food that are going to be struggling the most. And we know it's also got knock-on effects. The last time we had a really big food price hike was just before the Arab Spring. So there's knock-on effects, and not just hunger, but other sort of societal impacts that can create the feedback loops to things like conflict. So I think I've just got 2 more slides. The next one, please. In terms of like concrete, this one is just to highlight that we forecast that 2021 would be a difficult year, and it ended up being beyond our worst expectations. And I'm really sorry to be talking to you in March 2022 and saying, we don't see this. We were hoping that 2022 would be a bit of a recovery year, and lots of economies were starting to recover after the COVID shock. But now we're really fearing that 2022 is going to continue to be a massively challenging year in terms of global hunger. The next slide, please. Just a really concrete example is in Afghanistan, and we were hoping Yanti would be able to be here to talk to you about this, but 1 week's bread ration must now last 2 weeks. Many of our partners like World Food Programme have had to cut rations by half. There's just not enough food to go around. We know it's not adequate, but without additional resources, what we have to do is just spread things more thinly, and we know that just means children are going hungry, basically. And we've seen in Afghanistan at our clinics just a steady rise in the number of people coming in with malnourished children, and we know exactly what to do to treat malnourished, severe acute malnutrition. We know exactly how to treat those children, but we cannot stop that continued growing number of flow of children coming in, and we also can't prevent the children that have been treated going back home to circumstances where we know they may very likely fall back into that situation, because there's just a massive economic hunger crisis going on in Afghanistan, and projections were that up to 1 million children might die by the end of this winter, and I can't say that without choking up. So that's just to give you one little bit of a snapshot of what that means in reality in many of the countries we work, and our staff are having to be on the front line of this, and it's incredibly difficult for them every day to see us unable to meet the needs that we see in front of us. And of course, the humanitarians can't do everything, but it's because of the collapse of the ordinary systems that we're seeing these needs growing. I think there's just one more slide, just a little bit about Ukraine from me. So I won't go over this, but the Ukraine crisis is horrific in itself, and is also horrific in the knock-on impacts that it's going to have around the world, because of what I mentioned: grain prices, fertilizer depends on oil to be produced. Then we've got the fuel prices going up, and then you've got the other destabilizing things that happen when the markets get unstable. So for example, some countries like India might put export bans on their own production because they want to maintain their own domestic food security. But what that does is then create even more price uncertainty and even more food insecurity globally. We all are in an incredibly interdependent global system now. And so like one major producer having a big impact can just have like knock-on effects around the world. And I'll post into the chat, Save the Children put out a really good press release recently about the impact of the Ukraine crisis on food prices in some of our other hunger crisis countries. So that's just a bit of context. I'm so sorry it's not a really positive story, but I'll hand over to Gabriella about our response.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. You might want to move to the next slide. Yeah, so what are we doing about this? What can we do about it? For starters, one of the things we have done is, so Save the Children put out a global humanitarian response plan. We do that every year. We started that last year. So last year was our first try of this. We now have a 2022 humanitarian response plan. It's called Before It's Too Late. And the total ask of this response plan is 1 billion. In comparison, the 2021 response plan was 770 million. And now we're up to 1 billion. And that was before the Ukraine crisis. So that just shows you how rapidly things are increasing. What we did was, we looked from this response plan, how much of this is hunger related in our top hunger hotspots. And we're looking at about 400 million. That is the ask for hunger-related programming in the main hunger hotspots. So far, we have mobilized 350 million against the response plan. But as I said, the above figures don't include our Ukraine response, which is only 4 weeks old, for which we initially put down a package of 120 million on the table, which we thought was ridiculously ambitious, but which was fully funded within 2 weeks. And therein lies a beauty and a beast. The beauty is that we see an overwhelming response to the Ukraine crisis, and we are incredibly grateful to the outpour of solidarity from regular people, from companies, from governments, from organizations like ourselves, to the plight of the people of Ukraine. And it definitely is horrendous what people are going through. But we're not seeing that same level of solidarity with children in Afghanistan, children in Yemen, children in Ethiopia or Somalia. And they deserve equally our support for their future. So we would like to see the response scale up to the level of the Ukraine response, and not for Ukraine to slowly over time degrade to the level of the responses that we see elsewhere. For example, in Yemen, the pledging conference just a few days ago only received 1/3 of what it asked for. And Yemen is still the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Now, what we're doing as Save the Children, a couple of strategic points. One, it's a multi-sectoral response to hunger. The consequences of hunger on children are multi-sectoral. Children drop out of school, children are being asked to work, there is more strife in the family, or there's more strife in the community or in the country, so there is conflict. They also have protection knock-on effect on children. There are health concerns that Yolanda already mentioned. There are concerns around water availability, hygiene, and so on and so forth. And there, as I mentioned, knock-on effects on their ability to go to school or to learn if they're in school. So if the consequences on children are multi-sectoral, our response needs to be multi-sectoral. The other thing strategically that we do with our response to the hunger crisis is that it is an integrated program modality. These are some of the sector terminology, but anticipatory action basically means that you act before it's too late. You don't wait until a child is about to die. So what we were describing in Afghanistan, what I saw with my own eyes in Afghanistan back in December, is that because we had our hands tied behind our backs in our ability to respond, we were forced to wait until children were severely malnourished. And then when they're severely malnourished, that's when we can support them, because we are only allowed to do humanitarian life-saving response in Afghanistan, because there is a sanction regime on Afghanistan that doesn't allow anything else. So what does that do to beautiful children like Sarah, for example, that I met? Severely malnourished, beautiful little girl, her mom brings her to one of our clinics. We support them with therapeutic feeding. We send them back home, they patch her back up. Sarah is doing well again for a couple of months, but because Sarah can only survive on bread together with her family, because that's all they can afford, and even that is not enough, 2 months, 3 months later, poor Sarah is back at our clinic and we are back giving them therapeutic feeding. It is a ridiculously expensive way of operating. It is not dignified for Sarah. It's not good for her mom. It's not good for anybody. But that's unfortunately how we're forced to operate at the moment. What we need to do in areas where we can do it differently is bring that response forward and intervene when we see that families are stressed. Because if we intervene when families are stressed, we not only save lives, we save a lot of money. Nexus is another terminology where we basically say we need not only to address the humanitarian causes, but we also need to address the underlying causes that actually cause all these humanitarian consequences. So development programming and peace programming. Strategically as well, we're placing a bigger focus on analysis, accountability, and localization. We did a lot of children consultation, it was fantastic. So we spoke to kids in Kenya, Madagascar, Somalia, Afghanistan, and asked them, how is hunger affecting you and what would you like us to do about it? And we're accountable to them. So when they tell us and they told us, I'll show you a couple of quotes later on. When they tell us we want to make sure that I can go back to school, that's where this multi-sectoral approach is coming from. But we also go back to those children and we tell them, you told us this is what Save the Children is going to do. What do you think about that? And they're grateful for that. And they basically told us, consult us on what concerns us. Absolutely crucial. And it's lovely to do that kind of work with kids. We also have a strong advocacy agenda around our hunger program. And this is to influence key actors globally. For example, the G7, the United Nations General Assembly, the COP26 that Yolanda mentioned, or COP27 next time. But also some of the national policies around hunger. We're mobilizing our public and our supporters. So we're doing press releases, reports, fundraising events, basically asking our supporters, don't just give us money and your voice, influence. And last but not least, we're developing new partnerships with research institutions, philanthropists, and corporate partners. Okay, so we can go to the next one. One of the challenges that we face with this crisis is how to frame it. Initially, we started off by trying to frame this as a global hunger crisis, which it really is, because otherwise you create competition between Afghanistan or Ethiopia or Ukraine. We don't really want competition, right? We want to make sure that all children get an equal chance. The problem is that that doesn't get any cut through. So what we've done since then is to hang our hat on issues that basically get cut through in the media and with public attention. It was fantastic to hear. Well, not fantastic. It was you mentioned in the beginning, Catherine, that you said I hadn't heard about this. That's exactly our problem. That's exactly our problem. So we hear about the big ones, but there are so many small ones, and our job is to make sure that all kids get an equal chance. So next slide. So we're asking internally for a whole of system scale up in response to the hunger crisis, to scale up our nutrition and health interventions, to prevent mass mortality, to make sure that families have access to financial support and nutritious foods, to keep children in school, provide nutritious meals there, to galvanize our supporters, to partner with the private sector, and to change the way that we prepare in response to emergencies by acting before the risk actually becomes an emergency. Next slide. This is as of March 2022, covered in our famine appeal. When I did this presentation for the board in December last year, so only four months ago, we were looking at 13 countries. Now we're looking at 23. It is absolutely racing out of proportion. Next slide. These are the ones. So we still have sort of like what our big eight are. These big eight, we call them the big eight because they don't really change that much, right? I mean, Yemen is like I said, the worst global crisis in the world. But the ones to fear, for example, Somalia on the top of that one, we know that they're going into another drought, and that one will topple them over the edge. It's very acute at the moment in Somalia. Okay, and then I think it's the last slide. Yeah, so these are some of these quotes from children, and they're very smart, right? They tell us plant trees. We want you to make a big difference in our environment. They know it's coming from environments. They talk about conflict. They talk about we need to save money so we can prepare better for the next drought season. They understand. And so it's good to ask children what they want us to do, and also to get back to them on what we've done with their advice. And that's it, I think. Thank you. So maybe over to you for comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle and Yolanda. That really is sobering and jarring to see just in the last few months how things have gotten so much worse. I'll kick off with one question. I think one of the things that must be most difficult, and it probably falls to you, Gabrielle, I'm not sure, is planning. How are your models looking? Like what are you thinking, and how are you working with the uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have good tracking systems. For example, on hunger, the integrated phase classification is the system that all of us use to sort of like compare severity. But the problem with the IPC, it's a lag indicator. By the time the IPC starts flaring, that means we are already at sort of like the far end. There are other forecasting systems like FuseNet, for example, that is it's more forecasting based. Within Save the Children, we have a conflict forecasting unit. So we have forecasting for conflict, we have forecasting for hunger. What makes planning so difficult is that knowing where the crisis hits is one thing, the ability to respond is another one. We've been screaming about the Sahel for years, but the Sahel never really quite makes it to the top of anybody's agenda, does it? So it's very much an equation of the needs, and then needs versus our capacity to respond, and then our ability to respond. And on the basis of that, we plan.
One thing that we are trying to do is more, exactly as Gabriella was saying, is more with less, because in many of these crises we haven't got enough funding. So she was talking about anticipatory action where we can act early. That's much more cost effective, but that does depend on us having financing to act early. But the other thing that Adele was saying, and it might be great for you to share your experience, Adele, is I gave the example of sharing a food ration, but actually a lot of the time we try to give cash rather than food. And I will just mention this because what we're trying to do is support people's own coping strategies. And if you can provide cash, they can make their own choice, which is much more dignified, and also support their own local farmers and local markets. So actually often giving cash, cash goes further than the commodities that you might traditionally think of providing. And then we try and do a lot of things called Cash Plus, where we do the cash, but then we provide even simple things like behavior change communication about what's the most nutritious foods, or things like that, just to try and get the same outcomes, but with the most cost-effective means of doing it, basically.
What happens though? Drought is drought. So how are farmers? I mean, what happens with drought? How are farmers coping, or what do you do to mitigate that?
What you very often see in places like Somalia, for example, particularly pastoralists, right? They have big herds of camels and goats and things like that. And for them, they literally call it their bank account. So they don't want to dispose of their bank account. So for us, the logical thing when there are warnings of drought would be to say, start selling your cattle, right? Because otherwise they'll just thin out and die out. That's one of the most difficult behavioral changes that we're working on, because it's very, very difficult. And very often they hang on too long, and then they have to sell it under price and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of programs where we give them early warning to say, we know a drought is coming, sell now. We can underwrite it, we can give you cash for it so that you can buy back when the drought is over and that kind of stuff. And that then slowly but surely leads to some behavior change. We're also doing diversification of economy, because there are, because of environmental changes, there are now like too many people that have to, live off scarcity. So we do value chain programming, for example. So honey production in one place, honey bottling in another place, and then a little bit of honey marketing in the local markets in a third place. All of a sudden you have 3 jobs instead of 1. So there's a lot of programming that you can do to actually diversify how people live and what their livelihoods look like when the climate is changing around them. It's climate change adaptation programming.
That's great. But when you say drought, is it drought that affects the animals, or is it drought that people don't have water to drink and there isn't water to grow food?
Yeah, it depends very much on indeed the level of drought. But if we're talking Somalia level droughts at the moment, there's actually water scarcity, right? So in those situations, your last resort is what we call water trucking. It's literally what the word says. You truck in a truck with water to keep people alive, because even the boreholes then dry up. But some of our resilience programming there, we have it's rudimentary evidence, but there is rudimentary evidence that in those villages where we provided sustainable water sources like boreholes, those villages were able to hold out longer against the drought than some of the villages where those investments hadn't been made. What you then see is, of course, people from different villages start flocking to the ones who've been supported. It's also a matter of scale. So if you have investments of 23, 25, $80 million, it sounds like a lot of money, but $80 million is in essence, or can easily be wiped out if you have, a nationwide drought. So ultimately, it's about the scale of investment as well.
First of all, thank you for what you do. It's amazing, Gabriela, Yolanda, Adele, just amazing. I'm always struck by the courage and the innovativeness of the people across SAVE. So thank you. I have a question about thinking about how do you get people to donate to this, to care about it, and the challenge there. And Gabriela, you made reference to this when you talked about how do you frame this problem. And it just occurred, I'd love to hear more about that, because it's been my experience that the bigger a problem seems, the more it becomes an avoidance topic rather than an approach topic. And so it's important, what that leads you to have to do is people want to support solutions. They want to avoid problems. So how are you thinking about framing this topic to make it an approach topic, not an avoidance topic? And which is hard because it's so overwhelming.
That's exactly it, because like I said, we started off by thinking that we could change people's behavior or for people to care by showing how big the scale is. But it's almost having the opposite effect, like you said. And so we learned that the hard way, and we had to change and say, okay, at this particular point in time, people are a little bit more interested in, let's say, Syria, because the 10-year anniversary of Syria comes up. We take the 10-year anniversary of Syria, but we give a hunger message saying, look what 10 years of war does to a country like Syria, which was exactly the same as Ukraine is right now, right? It was a middle-income country, a well-educated population. Now, 10 years later, look where Syria is at, right? We're at the brink of starvation. So we use sort of like the moments in time where we have a little bit of cut through to make a difference. We also highlight the success stories, like Yolanda mentioned. So Madagascar was is absolute success story, right? I mean, the interventions helped avert a famine. That's it, and that's something to be very proud of. But and then the third thing I think we do is to break it down into bite-sized pieces. So if you want to donate $1, you can buy a child's, how do you say that, clean drinking water for, I don't know, a week. If you want to donate $10, you can buy therapeutic feeding, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
how do you get people to become interested in saving and feeding Black and brown children when we have the obvious problem of race? How do you surmount that? And how do you present it when you're fundraising? Is there an answer to that, I hope?
So it's a very difficult one, isn't it? So I would say my answer to that is, have you seen those photos of these really cute little kids? Impossible to ignore them, right? Whether they are brown or whether they are Black or whether they are white, you know, the moment you put a child's face on it, it's hard to ignore. I don't buy the argument that there is no more money. You know, look at with the Ukraine crisis right now. Germany overnight spent or added 100 billion, not 100 million, 100 billion to its Ministry of Defense budget, right? And also the response. Money is there. It is a matter of prioritization, right? You're asking, all 8 agencies combined are asking for 47 million for this year. So for 47 million, we can save all those lives we showed. Brown, Black, white, doesn't matter, all over the world. But we're saying that's too expensive. That we can't afford. Now, that's politics. And that's why we need your voices, because you are influential. I don't just want your money, I want your voice.
I think one thing we can do is, and that really works, is trying to combine our long-term development efforts with our short-term humanitarian. I was just chatting to Zimbabwe, our teams in Zimbabwe a few days ago, and they've done some really clever work where they combine short-term humanitarian cash with longer-term agricultural advice. So they've got a drought, not as bad as the drought in Somalia, but they've also got a drought. And they were, you know, some of the drought-resistant agriculture methods involve digging quite deep holes and filling them with compost and mulching them on top. And this is like effort. It's a new technique. You know, I know Jennifer's a gardener. I mean, you know, it's not easy to do all that work, right? And if your traditional method is simpler, you know, it's not easy to change behaviors and say to people, if there's a drought, you'll really appreciate this. But if you combine like cash transfers so that people have a little bit more ease to, like, you know, they've got a bit more money to cope, and then the training to say, come on, try this. And I can send you a photo of the incredible difference between the plot where they did that drought resistant agricultural methods and the plot that didn't, and it's incredible. And so the families that got that support are really surviving. I mean, there is limits to survival. When the drought is so severe, then people do sometimes have to move, and that's why we have so many internally displaced people in places like Somalia. But there is hope in a lot of places. There are things we can do, and I think we can show those good stories. And even where people have had to abandon their traditional livelihoods, I think there's huge scope for things like green jobs. We've got a big green jobs proposition that we're trying to put out. But like, yes, people may not be able to continue to do certain agriculture in some areas that are really seeing droughts year after year. But those places are amazing for solar production of solar energy, right? How can that become a positive, an area that, okay, it's no longer agriculture area, could be huge solar farms, could be generating electricity for huge parts of the country. So, you know, I really agree with that, trying to turn some of the negatives into positives. On the racism point, Deborah, I would just mention that I think there is some issues around some crises are more fundable than others, for whatever reasons. And I don't want to just say racism, I think also seems intractable, seems like it's gone on forever, people get bored, whatever. But I think that's why we need things like the flexible fund that Gabriella set up. It's a central humanitarian fund, and you appeal to people's goodwill about wanting to kind of do the best for children wherever they are in the world. And that fund allows us to redivert sort of centrally funded money into the underfunded crises. So we're not going to need to give more to Ukraine for a while, but we've got that central pot. We can prioritize children where they're not getting so much attention. So that pooled mechanism, I think, is a really strong tool that we can use to try and kind of deal with some of the market failures around fundraising.
I just want to jump in and say, I think that's a really good point, Yolanda, is people rely on us to sort of present to them the key opportunities for help. And if we promote the Children's Emergency Fund as, you know, the primary vessel to, you know, let an organization who knows what they're doing, who's boots on the ground, make the decision of the children who are in dire need and help prioritize that, because you have, you know, you have other stakeholders who are in countries servicing, you know, where the need is. So I think it's a matter of, if we're going to advocate for something, we should advocate for giving to this Children's Emergency Fund and just really, you know, let SAVE make the decision and execute in helping these kids.
And I think Jen's comment about the success story is important too, because you do get, like, I mean, even this meeting is smaller than some of our others. And I think partly it's like people just can't deal with it, right? You just, like, the scope of it is so overwhelming and so heart-wrenching that you just, there's a part of, you know, just of wanting to avoid it, right? Because it's just too much. And like you said, to both break it down in terms of like success stories, like have one vehicle and then focus on some of the success stories. And then I think the innovation piece of it too.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I just took a picture of like some of the kids' quotes, because I think that's so powerful too, is like bringing the voices of the kids, like, yes, this works. Yes, there are real people out there. Yes, these children are very real. And yes, we can help, like that, you know, it can get better.
What I love about those kids is that they're not victims, right? They are absolute agents of their own future, right? They have ideas, they've got dreams, they've got solutions, they have energy. All we need to do is to literally support that. That's all we have to do. So there's a lot we can do.
Yeah, I have an unformed comment, but I know that Jen and Catherine and Peg, who've traveled quite a bit as well, will know what I'm talking about. But, you know, until I went to Jordan and saw the refugees and Zatari and the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and saw refugees coming into Serbia, it's very, very, very hard to not to feel the differences. And it wasn't until I was talking to some Syrian refugees who were shop owners and doctors and closer to, you know, they weren't as impoverished, because generally refugees, the ones that come out first, are folks who actually have money and can get out more quickly. You know, you realize the scope of the problem, and you're much more able to not see them as other. And the challenge for all of the marketing is how we get people to not see these people as other. And Jen, I'm sure you feel the same way when you've gone into people's trailers. I mean, it's off-putting, it's scary to people. And until you actually can see them as human beings, it was hard for me. So Deborah, I was just going to say back to you, yes, there's racism, but I don't think it's only that. I think that people, you know, can relate to the Ukrainians because they're European, and it's not only that they're white, it's and that they're white, but people feel more proximate to it. And that's the challenge with famines in Africa. So I guess that's a marketing question, unfortunately, because we can't bring everybody over to the camps.
The good news is that, you know, Save the Children is doing really well. We had a blockbuster year in the US last year in terms of raising money. We have a new strategic plan for Save the Children International to increase revenues by 3 times. And we're getting better. You know, there's no question that we're getting more efficient. We're getting smarter. We still have our own goals that we do occasionally. But I think, you know, the more that we collaborate, the more transparency there is, the more we hear voices like Gabriella's and Yolanda's that are just really being informative, so that we're not, you know, sitting up in our towers or in our committee meetings and not really understanding what's going on. So that's why I love talking to all of you and Edel as well. It's just wonderful to hear from you and to get your insights.
So I was just gonna say that it's really good to hear everybody's commenter, because you all are bringing up very good points of how it has been hard to mobilize support for the for famine and hunger crisis. But we are continuing to think about different ways to do it. And I think, now, yes, with Ukraine and knowing that people are paying attention, and every time there are stories talking about the wheat crisis, it helps bring the message home. So we'll continue to look at different ways. I think, Susan, what you brought up in terms of not making it feel overwhelming, and Jen about like the positive examples. I think these are all things we have to keep building on to make it relevant for people and accessible.
Yeah. Just to build on what Peg and Deborah was saying, I think distance, emotional distance, is the biggest enemy to caring and donations and getting involved. And one of the things that the success stories do, but also Save the Children. Jen Garner said this when I first joined, talked about the fact that what you'll see that Save the Children is there, goes to where no one else wants to go. They go there, they're there. That's a huge advantage. While everybody else wants to run away, so many others want to run away from the problem, you run right into the problem. And it's running into the problem. And as Deborah said, when you see it face to face, running into the problem makes it possible, gives you hope, as well as a personal, it personalizes the story, it humanizes the story. So the more we bring the field to the front, the more we bring the faces to the front, that erodes emotional distance and brings you close to it. So I agree with Peg.
Yeah.
That's an indispensable part of what we can all help do, is make sure that this stays personal and emotional and not just a big overwhelming problem.
That's beautifully said, Susan. So I'm going to have to wrap it up. I hate to do it, but it's 1:01.